Hello again. I want to talk a little bit, I don't have slides, it's just me. I want to talk a little bit about how international law thinks about some of these questions, but I'm going to pose some challenges and questions. One of the dominating themes of the last 18 years has been self-defense. That is the justification that the U.S. presents for all actions post 9/11. And international law has a lot to say about that. But in the aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. launched military operations in self-defense against al-Qaeda. Is that okay? And here we are exactly 18 years later from 9/11, not from the launch of military operations. At least 7 countries, at least 5 groups, I don't have a count of it. It's probably 10 or 12 different terrorist groups later. And so I want to throw out to you a quote from General Petraeus from 2003 with reference to Iraq. So not with respect to these types of conflicts, but he was being interviewed by a reporter. It's 2003, so it's right at the beginning. What the U.S. thought was actually the end of a very quick conflict in Iraq. Turned out we were not correct. And he says to the reporter, "Tell me how this ends." Right? And he's already envisioning that it's not going to be clean, it's not going to be quick, that there will be some type of insurgency. Obviously, there was a rather intractable insurgency for a while. But I think this is an important question that perhaps doesn't get asked at the beginning of these types of conflicts. Tell me how this ends. What are we looking for, right? And we think about what Brian was just talking about, and I'll come back to this, what is victory, right? So we know at the beginning when the U.S. entered World War II, it was pretty clear how it was going to end, at least what a good end was going to be. The complete and unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan, total defeat. Right? That there wasn't a lot of question. What do we think is going to be a good outcome? What do you think is going to work? No, that was clear. Everybody knew that. I don't know. We'll come back to this, right? What exactly? Tell me how this ends. I think it's a really interesting question. So obviously, initial question, as I posed before, right? What does the end of conflict look like? And so the questions I want to pose are some companion questions that focus on the legal authorities. And when Bill comes up, I know he's going to talk a bunch about the domestic legal authorities as we enter what I think is a bit of a transitional period here. And on the international level, which is what I'll focus on here, I want to throw out 2 critical questions, which I think are sort of the dominant questions. One of them is, when does a conflict end, which is what Daphne was getting at. The key point there is that when the conflict ends, the law of war no longer applies. We return to our ordinary peacetime legal regime. So it's an essential question. Whether or not from a political point of view, it's an essential question. From a legal point of view, it's existential, right? We almost can't function unless we can answer this question. Hence, we're having trouble functioning right now. But the question that almost comes before it, which is what I want to start with, is when and for how long can a state rely on self-defense to justify the use of force? Because the extent to which a state can continue to pull out the self-defense card and wave it around is actually going to be a big hint for us as to how long a conflict is going to last, or when it might end. Because when a state can't rely on self-defense anymore, that might be a clue. We're getting to the end of the authorities that we can rely on, so maybe that means we're going to come at least, this is going to not be very clear, but we're going to come to the end of the start of these things, right? We're no longer going to be able to justify the initiation of force, the continuation of force, so perhaps we're entering the end game at least, right? One underlying question that we have not posed here today and is really the subject of enormous conversation is, what do we mean by war? right? The end of war project. War is a very fraught term. We have been tossing it around so far today without getting too legalistic about it. But in general, for an international lawyer, we're a little bit allergic to the word war because it's political. International law gave it up in 1945, 1949 with the Geneva Conventions. So it's either a very challenging question or it's a very easy question, right? If we want to think about it descriptively, war is when you're fighting with somebody else, right? Military operations against somebody else, let's not get into the legal niceties, or we can make it a really hard question. I just want to throw that out there because it's going to come back around to be a bit of a pest. So for starters, I want to look at the self-defense question because as long as the US or any other countries, and a number of countries have now relied on self-defense or collective self-defense as the justification against ISIS in particular. The US has been relying on it against Al-Qaeda and other groups since 2001. As long as we rely on that as different groups pop up in different locations, we really need to understand the scope. Because as long as that justification is still there, this war, in quotes at least, will continue. So, in international law, we think of self-defense. We can quote Daniel Webster back from the 1840s in the famous Caroline incident, but without getting into the details of that, self-defense was described, right, as an authority that was because it was instant, overwhelming, and leaving no time for deliberation. That's when you could use force. You were attacked, and you had to respond in a moment, again, when it was instant, overwhelming, and leaving no time for deliberation. Okay, let's match that up with 18 years. They don't match up that well, right? It's an interesting question. How can something be instant and leaving no time for deliberation for 18 years? It's English, it just doesn't work. So quickly, how does self-defense work? Because I think trying to match up the international law framework to the operational needs, that's what I really want to focus on. Self-defense under international law requires a country face an armed attack, either an actual armed attack or an imminent armed attack. If you are the victim of an armed attack, which is a very specific threshold under international law, then you may use force in self-defense as long as you meet two primary criteria: necessity and proportionality. There's a temporal consideration, but again, 18 years. I'm not going to focus on that one. The whole framework here of self-defense doesn't tell us how long you're allowed to do this for, but it gives us some clues to this question, right? It looks at the initiation of the use of force and the goals of self-defense, and that's where we get some clues about how long, how far, geographically, temporally, and so on, right? But, right, it raises a lot of questions. For example, right, an attack by a group primarily based in Afghanistan in September of 2001, right? Can we use that to justify the use of force in 2019 against a group in the Islamic Maghreb, in Somalia, in Libya, So far, the answer colloquially seems to be yes, because the U.S. is at least still claiming that. But the key thing here in understanding this is to think about the objectives, right? So these two requirements, necessity and proportionality, what do they tell us about the parameters for self-defense? First, necessity looks at the, guess what, the need for using force. And it says you can use force if there are no non-forceful alternatives to deter or repel the attack. Deter or repel the attack, okay? And the next one, proportionality, says you can use the amount or degree of force that is required to, again, achieve this objective of deterring or repelling the attack. You may use a lot more force than the attacker used, as long as it's proportionate to what you need to do to end this horrible thing that has happened to you. So, guess what we need to understand? What does it mean to deter or repel an attack? Those are the words in international law. When we put those against terrorism, against terrorist attacks, we immediately start to see a disconnect. Because how do terrorist attacks work? They tend to be spectacular attacks against soft targets. You don't deter them. You don't even repel them in the moment. They happen and you respond. You try to find, the attackers are not usually there. If they are, right? I mean, usually the leaders are not there. They send out folks. It's often a suicide attack. So it can be extraordinarily difficult. Terrorist attacks are not generally about gaining territory or achieving other conventional strategic objectives. So we begin immediately to grab more into our idea of the objectives of self-defense, and we might talk about preventing an attack from occurring. This is how states tend to formulate the authority to use force after one terrorist attack. So in 1998, after the embassy bombings in Africa, the U.S. used force against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and in Sudan. And what President Clinton said, it was not to stop the embassy bombings, they had happened already. It was to stop future attacks. And this is traditionally the justification. Again, it's highly elastic. Which future attacks? Any ones that the group might ever launch in the future? Immediate ones that you know about that are coming down the pike? Attacks that might be launched by a group that is friends with the group that launched the attack? Friends is a specific term in international law, I'll tell you that much. What can you do? Can you destroy the group entirely? Right? So let's put it in a more specific terms. Does preventing future attacks mean hitting 20 rocket launchers or other immediate targets like we saw yesterday here in this neighborhood? Or does it mean spending 16, 18, 30, 50 years battling al-Qaeda and every one of its offshoots? Is that what preventing future attacks means? Because if that's what preventing future attacks means, then we have to rename our project. There is no end of war, in essence, right? Another question, can you, in self-defense, defeat a terrorist group altogether? I'm not asking if you factually can defeat a terrorist group altogether, which is where Brian was going. That's a very challenging question. But would the law include that as an acceptable objective? So the way the U.S. has framed its two primary counterterrorism campaigns, al-Qaeda and ISIS. Against al-Qaeda, what the U.S. has said is its goal is to disrupt, dismantle, and ensure the lasting defeat of al-Qaeda and violent extremist affiliates. It sounds good. I like it. But wow, it's pretty expansive, right? I mean, lasting defeat of al-Qaeda and violent extremist affiliates. I know when Bill talks about domestic authorities, we'll get into the question of, how elastic is that? Does this actually mean the U.S. is claiming the authority to do anything it needs to do at all ever in the future to prevent terrorist attacks? So I thought it would be interesting when I was looking at this to look at the operational meaning of these terms and to then try to understand how the law applies, to match law to doctrine. So defeat, right? Defeat is a tactical mission task achieved when the enemy has temporarily or permanently lost the physical means or will to fight. It means the enemy no longer has the military capability to continue fighting, or it is no longer able to accomplish the mission because of low morale or mental exhaustion. So this doctrinal meaning rests on collective action. It rests on a commander at some level who says, you know what, guys? We're done. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough weapons. We don't have enough capability. Or essentially, I'm just crying uncle. Like, it's not worth it anymore. We're done. But terrorist groups don't necessarily function in this manner, where one person can say, we're done, or any leadership can say, we're done. The nature, particularly of radical, fanatic groups, makes that unlikely. They're decentralized, they're non-hierarchical, and the nature of the fanaticism makes it very difficult to affect a cost-benefit calculation, right? Which is what that idea of defeat is based on. So the physical manifestations going back to what Daphne was talking about, the physical manifestations of defeat, like surrender, abandoning equipment, other things you might ordinarily identify, if you were kind of doing intelligence analysis, hey, are they going to keep fighting? Well, I see they're doing this and they're doing that. Those things might not mean anything at all with respect to a terrorist group. Usually when a terrorist group withdraws, it means they're regrouping to fight another day, because the conditions are not really good for fighting, because they're not looking to meet face to face on a conventional battlefield. So our indicators are not really indicators anymore. The problem with this is that it means it's very hard to understand legally what self-defense allows. Because the ordinary things we would look at as, here are your objectives in self-defense, so now I can tell you whether you're meeting necessity and proportionality, whether you're following the parameters, are hard to identify, because the objectives don't necessarily allow us to identify when they're achieved, right? And so if it's that elastic, if the objectives are that elastic, and self-defense becomes that elastic, and I would suggest that we can look at the last 18 years of history and say, it's pretty elastic, can we even talk of an end to conflict, an end to war? Same thing happens with our terminology for ISIS. The U.S. strategy is to degrade and destroy ISIS. Again, destroy in U.S. military doctrine means to physically render an enemy force combat ineffective until it is reconstituted. That's just the essence of counterterrorism. I mean, in essence, that's the way a whole counterterrorism fight works. You beat them up for a while, they withdraw, they go underground, they reemerge. When conditions quiet down, they pop back up. That's exactly what ISIS did. That's how they went from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to ISIS. It's hard to know. How do you actually know you have achieved this mission of destroy? The idea of a terrorist group not being combat ineffective, the utility of that is limited as an analytical tool as well. And I have to say my example that I have written down in my notes is maybe, well, I guess it's actually perfectly apt on 9/11, right? A terrorist group can be combat effective with a few operatives and box cutters, right? I mean, this is the perfect day to remember that, unfortunately. The next question, right? Now, that's not exactly an uplifting conversation, but I think it's 2 minutes? I think it's important to understand how the law can actually be harnessed to keep the conflict going, right? International law generally wants to minimize the resort to war. Not the law of war, but the international law that allows you to use force is there to reduce the resort to force. To, as the UN Charter says, to end the scourge of war. The nature of these conflicts of terrorist groups may actually be helping the law be more expansive than we want. So I'll throw out a last question, and I'm sure we'll get to it in conversation, right? And it's a little bit of what Daphne got to, but one thing we will think about, and perhaps we'll get to talk about a little bit, is how does the law of war, how do we know conflict is over? Not just how do we know the enemy has surrendered, right? But we have an analysis for, hey, there's a conflict going on. Now the law of war is triggered. What's our analysis for, hey, the conflict's not going on anymore? Do we simply unwind the analysis we did before, right? What are the triggers we're supposed to look at? And I think that's a hard question in a conventional framework. It's particularly hard when we're talking about groups where our ordinary indicators maybe send us in the wrong direction. Thank you.